sorry, I should have put that on. Consultation on routes and the type of rapid transit system will be made by Essex Highways very soon. The date and a link will be available on our planning website as and when. The rest of that agenda were for housing land supply with update. There is still a major point of discussion between the examining inspector and his colleagues. This is to be resolved in the new year when the public examination of the emerging district plan will recommence on the 14th of January. It is to consider the 1,000+ responses that the North Essex authorities, that's us, Colchester and Braintree, have received to the final 6-week consultation on the sustainability appraisal and other evidence and suggested amendments to Section 1 of the plan. The last report we looked at was for RAMS, which is aptly named Recreational Disturbance Avoidance and Mitigation Strategy. This has appeared in every appeal decision I have read, and it is a stopper on development where land has not been allocated for building. There will be public consultations starting in January. I will ask the officers once more for date, links and contacts to be placed on the planning website. On to tonight's agenda, we have before us 5 reports, 4 of which we will decide. Item 9 is for comments to go to Cabinet. That is the heritage strategy, and it forms but one part of a larger overreaching strategy. Before I start on the meeting proper, do any members have any queries, comments they would like to make? I'll take that as a no, and I've been rather remiss. I'd like to welcome to our committee Councillor Sue Honeywood, who's taking over from Councillor Mick Skills Jr., who I'd like to thank for his input in the last meeting and in previous meetings. So I'll now move to the agenda proper. Any apologies for absence and substitutions, please?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies for absence have been submitted by Councillor Bush with Councillor Stevenson as his substitute.
Welcome.
And Councillor Henderson with Councillor Davidson as his substitute. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Minutes of the last meeting committee. I'll take confirmation that they are a true record, then I'll take any comments that members may wish to make. Thank you.
I wasn't here, Mr. Chairman.
That's right, fine. So may I sign those as a true record?
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you. Anyone like to comment on anything on the minutes? Councillor Stevenson, this is your opportunity. No, right, thank you very much. I will move on now to declarations of interest. Any declarations of interest?
There's a picture of my beach hut on one of the pictures shown in the book.
Good. You maintain it well, Councillor. Mrs. Hastings, would you suggest, as we both sit on an overview and scrutiny working party, which will be reviewing this, do you think we should declare that interest? Fine, right, thank you. Questions on notice pursuant to Council Rule 38? Do I have any? No, right. Nice to know. Public speaking? Fine. Mr. Marshall. Welcome, and I think you know the routine. I'll leave it to you. I knew that. Thank you.
Can I just say that on your last meeting, there was meant to be a 6-week public consultation, but it was not advertised at all, and so people missed that in the general public. So therefore, that 1,000 comments should have been more, because obviously if people didn't know, they couldn't comment. Okay. The first item is employment land. The emerging local plan is based upon the National Planning Policy Framework 2012 and the S1 is not going to be re-examined until the 14th of January. The S2 will not be considered for public consultation until after mid-2020. Being already past its best by date, at least 7 years or more, and with Brexit and new world trade scenarios upon us, this report is stale. Gary Guyver had to amend his figures during the opening events of the January 2018 public examination of the S1 to the surprise of all in attendance. The garden community proposals aspire to create one local job per one household within the garden community development. So why is tendering willing to sacrifice Grade 1 agricultural farmland to employment land for the garden communities when there are plenty of existing employment areas and opportunities at Severals, University of Essex, Colchester Hospital, Colchester Town, etc.? Officers seek the committee's endorsement to address some of the constructive criticisms raised during the public consultation. What are these criticisms, and when was the public consultation? I suggest the committee does not forward this for consideration for the Section 2 public examination until further evidence and work is considered.
You're very welcome to make further comments as I reach the various parts in the agenda, or did you wish to continue? It's entirely up to yourself.
You have 5 items on the agenda, so I've asked to speak on each one. Yeah, so when you call me, I'll come. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll just respond to the point that Mr Marshall made about the consultation. The planning inspector has actually asked for all 3 of the North Essex authorities to submit a statement outlining the consultation efforts and publicity that was undertaken. That has been submitted to the inspector, and that actually sets out where the consultation, how we notified residents about the consultation, and how it was publicised through the press and on social media as well. So that has been forwarded to the planning inspector for his consideration, and I understand Mr Marshall has made comments to the planning inspector highlighting the concerns he's just raised with us, but we've responded to those in writing to the inspector, setting out how we undertook the consultation and publicised it.
Thank you, Mr Guyver. Thank you, Mr Marshall. Your points have been noted. Item 6, a report of the Corporate Director, Planning and Regeneration, Employment Land, pages 17 to 208. I really can't... I normally do a précis of this, but frankly, the précis is in front of us. I didn't wish to reinvent the wheel. To report the findings of the latest employment land review for tendering, which updates the evidence base in support of employment land policies in the emerging local plan. A. B. Seek the committee's endorsement for suggested amendments to the employment policies aimed at ensuring that they are up to date, address some of the constructive criticisms raised during public consultation and are as robust and effective as possible. And finally, C. To seek the committee's agreement for suggested amendments to be put forward for the planning inspector's consideration when they come to examine Section 2 of the local plan in 2020. At this stage, I'll pass over to Mr Guyver, our officer, who will take us through the report. Mr Guyver, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, and good evening, members. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. One of the roles of the local plan is to set out the council's policies on employment land, and that is the protection of existing sites that are used for business and industrial purposes, and also allocating new areas of land to encourage inward investment into the area. And this is all to do with the business and industrial sectors that require large areas of land to operate. An employment land review is an important part of the evidence that the council needs to inform the policies that it puts in the local plan. Now, our local plan was submitted 2 years ago to the Secretary of State, and even in that time, there are various things that change, and it's very important to ensure that the evidence is kept up to date. The Council commissioned consultants to undertake a review of our employment land evidence, and that is attached as appendix to your reports here, starting on page 39. So key findings from this evidence are that actually the demand for additional employment land, that's over and above all the employment sites that we have in the district, is actually quite low. And that's mainly because the economy in this area is dominated really by the service industries as opposed to business and industry. So the projected demand is actually very low at between, up to 9 hectares up to 2033. And that's based on market research and looking at various trends and forecasts. But we've got quite a lot of land already with planning permission, which actually accounts for 27 hectares. And there's an additional 17 hectares of land set out in the emerging plan as it stands at the moment. In the employment land review, we've asked them to assess 53 hectares across a range of different alternative sites across the district to advise on their potential for employment use. Bear in mind it's a top council priority to boost employment, stimulate the economy and to be open for business. The Employment Land Review concludes that we've got a lot of sites already in employment use across the district, and they play a very important role in providing local employment and opportunities for existing businesses to relocate, expand and to operate. I mean, the overall conclusion from the Employment Land Review is we don't really need to allocate any additional land for employment in our local plan. There's more than enough there to meet the projected demand. If I move on to what the local plan actually says, we've got a need for 20 to 38 hectares of employment land set out in the emerging plan. And as Mr. Marshall rightly said, when we had the examination of Section 1 of the local plan, we revised those figures to take into account the latest projections, and we revised those to a range of 12 to 20 hectares, and that was in line with the latest projections that were available at the time, and it corrected some of the problems with the figures that were originally in the Section 1 local plan. So our new evidence actually broadly supports the view that a lower requirement of employment land is required, and so the new evidence is broadly in line with where we are with the local plan. So if I move on to policies now, there are essentially two important policies in the plan. One that protects existing employment sites for employment use, so they don't get redeveloped for housing unnecessarily, to ensure that they're protected for that use. And the other policy is to allocate future sites for employment use so we can encourage businesses into the area. When we undertook the consultation on the local plan 2 years ago, a number of comments came back on these policies, which made some very pertinent points. On the employment protection policy, some of the objectors suggested that actually the wording of the policy was a bit confusing and could be simplified. And they also pointed out that actually in our draft local plan, we don't actually show the locations of where the protected employment sites are. We refer to the evidence in which you will find that information, but the plan itself doesn't show where the protected sites are. And on reflection, officers actually agree that the policy would benefit from being simplified and for all of the employment sites to actually be shown on the maps of the local plan. And there's a list of sites there on pages 18 and 19, which we would suggest are shown in the local plan as protected employment sites. On pages 19 and 20, you will see the suggested wording for the employment protection policy as would be amended. The policy on employment allocations, so this is the policy that shows new sites that can be used for employment use in the future. In the draft local plan, the list of sites in there doesn't really reflect the full range of employment land that is available in this district. And although the local plan is essentially a policy document that we use for determining planning applications, it's also a promotional document for the district in some ways, because those looking to invest and bring business to our district will consult the local plan when determining whether there is land available in the district to be able to go on to. So what we are suggesting here is that in light of the new evidence in the employment land review and the fact that a number of sites have already obtained planning permission for employment, that we actually show all of those sites, the full range of sites that are available with planning permission for development in the district. And on pages 20 to 21, you will see the table within that policy which lists all the sites we suggest should be shown in the local plan. And that includes things like the extension to Gorse Lane Industrial Estate, which is currently underway. It includes the land that's been approved at Brook Park West, and moving elsewhere in the district, land that has permission for the expansion of Landswood Park in Elmstead Market. And we've also got in there the land at Horsley Cross, which initially was excluded from the plan because there were question marks over whether it would come forward or not, but actually that has detailed planning permission now, and there is some movement on there, and the consultants have suggested that we keep that within our arsenal of available employment sites. So there are recommendations in here to make suggested amendments to the draft local plan. And the way that we would do this is we would suggest them to the inspector as part of the examination of Section 2 of the local plan, because we've already submitted the plan. So it's with the inspector to determine what happens from now on in. But we can make suggestions to the inspector for improving the employment land policies in our local plan in light of the new evidence, in light of the comments that were received. And if I can then ask you to look at the recommendation, which is on page 22 of your agenda. The recommendation is that the committee firstly notes the findings of the employment land review, which is part of the agenda here from page 39, and agrees to its inclusion within the council's evidence base for the local plan. It considers and approves the officer's suggested amendments to 3 policies there: policy PP6, which is the protection of employment land policy; policy PP7, which is the allocation of new sites for employment; and policy PP13, and that's a policy on boosting the rural economy, where we're suggesting that some of the lengthy criteria that were included originally in policy PP6 are more akin to rural areas and should be included in that policy. And finally, to authorise the head of planning in consultation perhaps with the chairman of the committee to put forward those amendments to the planning inspector, so that they can consider that as part of the Section 2 local plan examination. And what I've included within the agenda pack here on pages 205 through to 208 is a tracked change version of the 3 policies in question, so you can see how officers are suggesting those policies could be amended. And that's what would be put forward to the planning inspector if the committee so wishes.
Thank you, Mr. Guyver. One another. Thank you. Any questions? Councillor.
Yeah, but what concerns me is that we've got employment land or employment bases there in Walton that's not being used. They've been derelict and shut up for must be in excess of 15 years, and that is in Mill Lane. Now, I know the council's policy is to hold that back until someone comes and buys it to develop it, but you yourself said we're dominated by service industry. Now you had, 10, 12 units there that were ideal for service industries, plumbers, electricians declaring interest there, builders that wanted a little yard, little office and work from there. And it's been left there just desolate for 12, 15 years. Why can't we add that into this? Because we're talking about one job per household. Well, in Frinton alone, there must be excess of 1,000 houses being built. Yeah. Well, I would settle for 1,000 jobs in the Frinton Walton Town Council area. So, but I don't know how we can manage this or prove it, because not with the land and that's in here. That's for my own area. It's all right on the west here, over in Clacton. But we've got 20,000 people in my area and no jobs. Yeah, go on.
Would you like to take that, Mr. Guyver, the questions as they come?
I'm happy to.
Yes, it's fine. Yes, well, I'll leave you. Yes, indeed.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, from my recollection, there was a master plan produced for Walton on the Naze, a Walton Regeneration Framework, and that was about 2008. And one of the recommendations in that was actually some of the smaller sites within Walton, including Mill Lane, including Avon Works as well, which is close to the station, that some of those smaller sites could potentially be released for alternative uses to employment, because they weren't providing the kind of standard of accommodation that a lot of businesses looking to move into the area were looking for. But that's to say, that's not to stop businesses utilising those premises for employment use, but the recommendation at the time was that they provided small accommodation, not ideally located for the modern purposes of businesses. And one of the recommendations from that was to take the shackles off and allow them to be redeveloped for alternative uses if schemes come forward. Now, clearly, schemes haven't come forward. There's nothing to preclude those units being used for employment use, and I think if the opportunity came up, we would wholeheartedly support that. But I think the reality of the economics is that modern businesses looking to move into the area are looking for purpose-built, modern accommodation. And some of these smaller sites within our urban areas don't tick a lot of the boxes that they're looking for.
Well, you say that, but at the bottom of Mill Lane, what's that area called there? There's where all the units. Is it Paul?
The old ambulance station, the old Walton Council offices.
No, if you go down, they were put up for sale by the council and they were snapped up, the whole lot, and they've been fully vacant since. Small units with people, service industries in there, air conditioning, carpenters and people like that. And I say there is a demand for that, and we should be looking at the other sites for, as you say, for service industries. Not all service industries employ 20, 30 people, especially not now.
I think if I can help set your mind at rest on this, I don't disagree with a single word you're saying or what you're proposing. Well, I do believe that this policy, PP7, does, because we've certainly had discussions behind the scenes on it before we came forward brought it to the committee and the public, is if you look at on page 21 of the agenda, you will notice the penultimate paragraph in PP7 states, proposals for new development, employment-related development on land outside of these allocations will be considered on their merits, having regard to the potential to support economic growth in the district and the requirements of other policies in this local plan. So if somebody's got an idea and wishes to develop the Mill Lane site, they can come to us with a proposal and it will be looked on in a very positive light. because it's one of the things that both the Deputy Chairman and myself have been, especially as she understands the rural hinterland to a tendering far better than I do, that is one of the most important things for those in that part of tendering. That if somebody comes and proposes to use an old building for something or other, and then we say, oh, you can't do that because we haven't allocated it. Well, we can allocate it now, and that's the point of this, the part of this policy.
Well, our problem is
I can't really comment on that, Councillor Allen. You might like to say it. I could possibly only think it. But our Director of Inward Investment and Planning will look into this and come back to. You'll come back to the committee,
yeah.
Mr. Green. Thank you very much. Right. Any other comments? Yes. Councillor Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm interested in PP13, the rural economy, on page 208. There are pockets of the rural community that have farmers that have diversified by changing some of their buildings and where they let out their buildings to an accountants, architects. And in my part of the world, there is a bus company that has taken over a rural farm. There's other parts. And I like the idea of diversification of schemes and to benefit the rural areas. It will also protect rural areas because there are some buildings that are left neglected for years, and it will protect the land, the security of outbuildings and the rural community. And having businesses in there will bring people in. It will bring jobs for the rural communities, and it will actually change the diversification of farmers from maybe farmers who may not want to graze cattle anymore or plant wheat or so on. It would change, and I think this policy will work really, really well, especially in my part of the world. And obviously having a couple of rural councillors on here is useful because TDC area is predominantly mostly rural, and obviously the rural areas play a large part in bringing money into our district, not just the service industry, but also the rural areas that have a huge impact on transport, people moving in and commuting backwards and forwards out of the district from South Suffolk or from Colchester. But I don't know whether if Mr. Guyver can add any more on this, or what else the council's proposing to do.
I mean, that's a very interesting point that Councillor Scott raises, because although we've allocated a lot of specific sites around the district over the last few years, a lot of the growth in employment has actually come from these farm diversification schemes, because there are properties there that need to be utilised in an economic manner. Very often, because they're small and dotted around the district, they provide a lot of choice for investors, and some of these properties work exceptionally well for particular businesses. I think the policy as suggested has been quite successful in the past in encouraging that kind of use of farm buildings, and indeed there are certain permitted development rights that farm owners can use to actually convert some buildings for building use, for business use, without even needing planning permission. So I think the policies, the way they're set out, and also the government rules on what you can and can't do without planning permission, are very positive about encouraging farms to diversify. And I can't think of anything specific other than what's here that I would suggest, other than to say it's been very successful in this district in the past, and I think it will continue to be so.
I welcome what Mr. Guy was just saying, and I think it's vital, but I also like to perhaps include something, improve communications. The government is proposing to improve communications, 4G, and the roll out of broadband, and it may be interesting to maybe have some encourage farmers who have maybe derelict buildings to include telecommunications in their roofs. If they don't want to let them out to places who want to use them, perhaps we can use these, encourage farmers to have maybe better communications in buildings. They're not used, but we could maybe use for telecommunication purposes. I know of a farm that's in Elmstead that has a telecommunication phone tower to increase the broadband and phone network, and this farmer gets quite a large amount of money that he may not necessarily have got if it wasn't on his land. And I think we should really seriously think about it, especially when the government is intending to encourage a rollout of 4G or 5G further on, and they're encouraging rural areas to have super fast broadband. In my part of the world, I'm lucky to have 3G. In other parts of the world, in my ward, we have 4G. But some areas of TDC area, you'd be lucky to have a signal full stop. But there's loads of buildings, and that might be something to worth thinking about, encouraging farmers to uptake the possibility of broadband and communication. And it might be something we could possibly include in PP13.
Thank you, Councillor Scott. I completely agree with you about broadband. It's an eternal mystery to me how on my boat in the middle of the Adriatic I can get as good as I can, 60 metres from a box in 2nd Avenue, Frinton. At the same time, in the middle of tendering, you can't get anything. And every time I ask, I just get a blank look at me, and I just don't comprehend. I don't comprehend it at all. And it's something that I have asked Mr. Green to look into for us, and as part of his remit for the authority. I'm not sure whether we can add anything to this policy at this moment. If I'll wait on advisement for that from Mr. Guyver. But I do agree with you. If we're going to actually develop the rural hinterland and allow those with redundant buildings to be able to reuse them for the benefit of all, then we've got to have a minimum of 4G in, preferably 5G.
I totally agree with that. I mean, in the rural north of Colchester, in Oldham and Wormford and places around there, County Broadband, not Essex County Council, but County Broadband, have their headquarters there, and they're rolling out rural broadband fast as anything. And they are using the rural areas like old buildings and agricultural buildings for the purpose of improving broadband in the rural areas. If they can do that in the rural north of Colchester Borough, why can't we do that in the rural central part and west and north of our district?
Sorry, Mr. Guy.
Thank you. So if I just respond to the policy suggestion, there is actually a separate policy within the emerging local plan that's completely separate to the employment one, which does actually support proposals for telecommunications infrastructure utilising existing mast buildings. But although it's not specifically set out in the rural economy policy, because you could do it in urban areas potentially as well, there is policy support for that kind of thing, although it's positioned elsewhere within the document. But I don't think I have any issue in principle with looking at the wording to see if we can incorporate that into it. But I don't think it's essential. I think it is covered in the plan, but I'm happy to go away and look at that.
Would you like to take that forward?
I would like us to actually seriously look at that, because I think farmers
fine.
areas will take that, and if it's I'll move something if it's possible.
Well, have you got some wording ready?
To encourage farmers to take up the telecommunication projects within in their areas.
Fine. Can everyone hear that? Oh.
To encourage farmers in agricultural areas to uptake telecommunication schemes in their areas to boost jobs and better communication infrastructure.
I'm happy to add that. If anyone, the rest of the committee?
Happy with that.
Yeah? We don't. Well, we're going to vote on the whole thing in a minute, so that would be then part of that. No, you don't need to be amended. It's just an addition. It's a suggestion. It's an addition, so it's not an amendment. It's an addition. We're not changing the wording of this. We're merely adding to it. Yeah. So it leads, and that will allow our officers to lead that into the main policy, which we'll be discussing at another meeting. Okay? Yeah. On that basis, is everybody satisfied? Councillor Stevenson. I understand that, and I was hoping it was going to be out by Thursday. The Thursday before that would have given us it would have given you 9 to 10 days to read it. But my suggestion didn't come to fruition.
It was on. Apologies.
Sorry, just to let everyone know, I haven't got a master, so we have to literally do it.
Sorry, I thought it was on. Oxford Road. I'm using it as an example more than anything else because it's the only employment. It's page 168 of an example of where we have residential fighting employment use on a grand scale. A lot of the large business owners down there are trying very hard to convert their existing business properties into residential. TDC doesn't seem to fight this very hard. In fact, the latest one, which came from Europits, was actually stopped by Essex County Council, not us. And that was through a lack of parking spaces. And that's predominantly the main reason why it's a problem, is because you have this conflict of interests with residents and industrial units, as it's quoted, literally sitting on top of each other. So are we going to be a bit more robust? Are we going to change? I haven't got any wording for it, but it does seem very weak when you say we will look to protect the employment land, where you turn around and say, bear with me, did have it, I was too busy talking. It says the proposal for non-employment uses on these sites will only be considered if, and then when it goes through the A and B, this is pages 19 and 20, they're relatively weak. It says if you're not using them and can prove you're not using them, then we might let you build on them. Well, if planning housing is anything to go by, you're not allowed to pull up trees or hedges, but you just do it beforehand and then say, look, it wasn't there. So the same problems will apply to employment land. If you trash the buildings and then say nobody will take them, then you'll probably get planning permission to put the stuff on. And I'm curious whether there is a loop with permitted development where we can have business use put onto these areas, which is B1, I believe, and then business use could be offices, which could then have permitted development into flats and housing. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Guyver?
No, very good points. We had an appeal decision in Oxford Road about 15, 16 years ago that went against us, that allowed that block of flats to sort of segregate the Oxford Road industrial area. And ever since then, we've had proposals coming up to either completely wholesale turn sections of it into residential or to go for residential above commercial units. And I think one of those got through as well, and they've got commercial units on the ground floor. But we've also had cases, I think 112 to 118 Oxford Road, which was a scheme to go for residential, which the council refused, and that was upheld on appeal. And I think there's actually a current application with us somewhere in that area as well that's in the process of being determined as well. And similar kind of issues prevail with that one as well. So I'm very much aware of the issue. I think the wording in here reflects quite closely actually what government expect in terms of employment land protection, because really the only circumstances where we should be allowing these to go is if an applicant can robustly demonstrate that there's an inherent problem. So they can't just say, the site's no good or anything like that. If it's in the middle of a wider industrial area, I think it's going to be very difficult to argue that there's an inherent problem unless they're coming in to redevelop the entire Oxford Road industrial area. So I think that criteria is fairly strong, actually. And the second criteria, B, is that in exceptional circumstances we might permit an industrial area to be converted to an alternative use if it achieves wider regeneration benefits. I know we spoke a little bit earlier about Mill Lane in Walton, one of the proposals in the Regeneration framework was to redevelop that site because it was felt that the benefits of redeveloping it for the area would be better than retaining it in employment use. So they don't come up very often, but you have to have a framework of policies in place so that you can deal with them when they do come up. And requiring robust evidence of marketing as well is an important element of that, because if genuinely a property owner has tried to use it for employment use, he's just getting no interest whatsoever, and we'd get it independently checked, we wouldn't just take their word for it, then there could be a good case for looking at an alternative use. But someone coming in with a scheme in the middle of an existing industrial area trying to turn it into housing, I think they're going to struggle to argue that it's inherently unsuitable or unviable. But we need to have policies in place to cover that eventuality.
Councillor Stevens.
Sorry, Chair. I used Oxford Road as an example, not as just to discuss it. But using the example, we already have an industrial zoning of that area. And when buildings for residentials were put forward, the robustness of what you were talking about wasn't there. You know, that's my problem. And it's okay having the policy, but where's the support for that policy? And my concern is that all these sites that you've got, we didn't seem to push back against the employment, and we've just let other people make their comments, and it was deferred on then. It wasn't deferred on the grounds of being in an industrial estate. It wasn't denied on the grounds of being in an industrial estate. So if we've already got it in place, the wording's fairly similar, and we didn't fight it, what makes this stronger? Thank you.
Just want to respond. I mean, the publication of this report is part of the evidence that helps us. It doesn't only inform the local plan. If we do get applications that we refuse and have to defend an appeal, this report in itself is a piece of evidence that we would put forward to support the policy.
Happy with that, Councillor Stevenson? Can I offer my apologies for being late? Not at all. Welcome. Sorry, I'd have waited a couple more minutes if I'd read my notes properly. Mr. Gar- right, any other comments? Certainly. Councillor Chapman.
On the page 18-19, where you've got the protected employment areas, and I'm going on Brightlingsea, you've got Morses Lane, Shipyard Estate. We're unique, no. We've actually got quite a large area that's being formed at the moment for industrial. As you come into Brightlingsea, it always had an industrial unit there, light engineering, but it's all been totally revamped, incorporating, I suppose, some of the old farm buildings that were always used. Is there no way that can be put into the protected employment area? Because when they're finished, which they nearly have, I feel they're going to be employing more people there than our Shipyard Estate will be. And I'd hate to see that go over to residential development. No, it's... Do you know the area I mean? As you come into Brightlingsea, where the church is, just round on the bend there, we've got a listed building, and then right next door, and then there's a farm where they've just done it all up. There's a lot of industrial units being put in there.
Yes, thank you. I mean, that's an example of an employment development that's been created on a site that's not specifically allocated. And in terms of what this policy is doing, it's trying to protect the established employment sites within the area, but without stopping new ones coming forward. I mean, what we could do is look at the policy wording to see if we can offer protection of those sites when they come forward. But generally speaking, a lot of them are much smaller. And a lot of the ones that are not shown in the list tend to be the ones that are perhaps occupied by a small number of businesses. It's not comprehensive. It doesn't cover absolutely everything, but it covers the ones that the consultant has recommended that we specifically protect. But it's certainly something we can look at, whether there's any protection that can be afforded to new ones that once they're up, you want to keep them there.
It always was like engineering. We had Easy Power and different people in there, and then they closed, and now it's been revamped up anyway to make more units. So it always was industrial. So.
Any other comments? Councillor Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. Just on the employment land, I know of a large industrial unit in Alsford that has been vacant for 15 plus years, and you said a moment ago that someone goes out there and assesses or approaches them to see if it's viable and stuff like that. And I'm wondering whether there is there such a person that goes out and checks, because this property, a large industrial unit in Alsford, hasn't been in use for 15 plus years, and it's literally dilapidated and it needs urgent attention. But it still classes industrial use and employment land. Don't you think we should have a time scale on it on large properties where the time scale is, say, 15 plus years? Because if they're not going to do anything now, what's the point of having them there for another 15 years on top of that? I just want to know whether there's something we can put.
Yeah, that's a good point. Actually, I'm thinking about 10 years ago now, actually, through our Regeneration team, there was a survey done of all vacant and available property across the rural areas of the district. And actually, in identifying those opportunities, we managed to encourage a lot of businesses into those areas. I don't know the specific one that you're referring to, but I think this policy is mainly concerned with protecting the larger established sites. As Councillor Turner said earlier, the policy does support, if somebody wants to come forward with a business scheme that would utilise those buildings, we'd be all for it in principle. But what we're not doing is trying to identify every single unit that could possibly be used for employment use across the district. This is to just protect the main established areas from going to alternative uses.
Okay, may I move to the vote? Bearing in mind the comments that have been made, in particular to rural broadband, or broadband generally. Telecommunications. And obviously the other comments that other members have made will be noted and will be addressed and brought back to this committee sometime. Possibly in the spring will be our next meeting. Terry, have they declared an election yet?
I think so.
Yeah. Well, our friends who wear yellow haven't told us, and they're usually first in the know. Anyway, so all those in favour, please show. Including. That's unanimous. Thank you. Sorry, we've had a good debate, which is lovely, especially with the bigger the report, the less that usually gets said. Right, now we move on to item 7, which is a report of the Corporate Director for Draft Housing Strategy and Planning Policy for Affordable Housing.
Remember Mr. Marshall.
Yes, thank you, yeah. I'll just give us a lead in on this, and I'll ask Mr. Marshall to come and make his comments. A is to present the draft housing strategy to us and invite members to make comments. To report to the committee the current position in respect of delivering affordable housing and the practical issues that have arisen in the application of the Council's emerging local policies. C, to seek the committee's endorsement for suggested amendments to the emerging local plan's affordable housing policy aimed at maximising the delivery of affordable housing in light of weak delivery in the past. And finally, to seek the committee's agreement for the suggested amendments to be put forward to the planning inspectors for the planning inspectors' consideration when they come to examine Section 2 of the local plan in 2020. Mr. Marshall.
Good evening. Affordable housing. National Planning Policy Framework 19, paragraph 34, states development contributions should not undermine the deliverability of the plan or development. Just last week, Rose Builders came back to the Planning Committee with an existing approved planning application and 106 agreement that was now unviable. This development is now being delayed. Please remember that affordable homes are a tax on ordinary market homes where buyers are made to contribute unknowingly to the affordable home proportion of the development. National Planning Policy Framework 1964 states a figure for affordable homes of at least 10% should be used. Tendering are penalising developers with a 30% affordable homes contribution. This could affect future housing development in the district. I suggest committee ask officers to rethink affordable homes viability and the taxing nature upon the developers and ordinary market home purchasers. Thank you very much.
Again, your comments are noted, and I'm sure they will some of them, if not all of them, will be addressed during the debate. So I'll once again hand over to Mr. Guyver to lead us through this.
Thank you, Chairman. So the first part of this report is about the Council's draft housing strategy, which is attached as an appendix within your agenda from page 225. And this has been prepared by our colleagues in the Housing Department to update the previous strategy. And one of the key findings, really, of that work is that there is still quite a significant need for affordable housing to meet the needs of people that cannot afford to buy or rent property on the open market. We're certainly not alone as a council in having a big demand for affordable housing. It's similar across the country, but there is a particular need for housing. So, for example, you'll see in the report on 209 that over 1,500 households on the housing register looking for affordable accommodation. And the housing needs evidence that underpins the local plan, the Strategic Housing Market Assessment, suggests that we need to deliver 160 new affordable homes each year to address and keep on top of that need. In the past, we've struggled to get anywhere near our affordable housing requirements, and that's for a range of reasons. Essentially, one of the reasons was we had just very low levels of house building generally, whether that be market housing or affordable housing, until very recently, when, of course, the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen a substantial increase. A lot of the developments, Mr. Marshall alluded to this, that sites of lower than 10 not required to provide affordable housing, and a lot of our development in tendering is actually on those smaller sites, so they are not required to incorporate an element of affordable housing, so they don't contribute. And also there's been a number of development sites granted planning permission in the last few years with a lower level of affordable housing incorporated within that than would have been required by the local plan. Normally viability tends to be an issue, but we also had a period of time where, because registered providers like housing associations, they weren't in a financial position to be able to deliver affordable housing. So for a period of time we actually had a flexible approach to our policy, whereby we accepted a smaller number of houses being gifted to the council or to another registered provider, such as a housing trust like the one we have in Lawford, instead of providing the full 30% that the housing policy in here asks for, which was good at the time because it allowed some of the developments to actually take place, whereas at the time it was questionable whether they would happen at all. But the implication of that is a lot of the developments that are coming forward are delivering a relatively small number of affordable homes, and we still have this huge demand to meet in the future. So what's being suggested within this report is we relook at our emerging affordable housing policy. Now, the affordable housing policy, as written at the moment, requires up to 30% of homes on sites of 11 or more dwellings to be provided in the form of affordable housing, i.e. transferred to the council or to a housing association for use as affordable housing. And that is based on, one, the overall need, which is about a third of all houses that are required, but it's also based on evidence of viability as well. Because there's no point in setting an affordable housing target which is economically unviable for developers to deliver. You have to set it at a level which developers can afford to do. And one of the appendices to this report is the new updated economic viability study from page 253. Certainly not asking anybody to read it and fully understand it, but the main finding from that is, for the majority of cases across our district, 30% affordable housing is viable for major residential schemes. So our policy in the local plan is still viable. Originally, we had a section of our affordable housing policy that allowed 10% affordable housing if it was accompanied by a financial payment towards delivering the other 20% somewhere else. And that was to just have a very flexible policy to allow affordable housing to be delivered in a range of manners. But because we've had this under-delivery over a number of years, we're looking to tighten up on that now. So the policy will be simplified, and the policy will be, we will expect 30% of dwellings on sites of 11 more houses to be affordable housing. And really the only circumstances where we might accept something lower is if they can clearly demonstrate that for that particular site it's unviable, in which case they would have to submit a load of evidence that we would have independently checked, or if the nature of the development doesn't lend itself to affordable housing. For example, perhaps a flatted scheme where perhaps in management terms it would be difficult to have affordable housing mixed up among private apartments, in which case we might look at a financial payment instead. Again, because this policy is part of the emerging plan, which is with the inspector, what we would be doing is suggesting this as an amendment to the policy to the inspector when we come to examining section 2 of the local plan. And before I move on to the recommendation, I just want to pick up on the point that Mr. Marshall made about how this policy penalises developers and the occupiers of private housing. It's actually a very long-established policy nationally to secure a percentage of accommodation on large residential sites as affordable housing. And essentially the way that is funded is that the developer will make a deduction from the amount of money they pay the landowner for the land to take into account the discount that you would have to offer on affordable housing. So it's essentially the landowner and the amount of money that they get paid for the land, that's what pays for the discount on the affordable housing. It's not directly the occupiers of new market housing. They would be looking to buy at whatever the market value is. It is the landowner, if anybody, that is penalised by the policy. But it's a long-established policy. Developers have known about this for many, many years. Developers make the necessary adjustments to the amount of money they pay to the landowners and have been doing it for a very, very long while. And we have some sites where that has been achieved, but we need to achieve that on more of our sites to ensure that our affordable housing requirements are met. The implication of not doing it, not only do we have this ongoing issue with housing need and a growing housing waiting list, but increasingly we're finding at planning appeals that developers are arguing that you need our site over and above all the other sites you've got in the local plan because you're not meeting your affordable housing need. So what you need to do is you need to significantly increase the total number of houses you're building across the district to ensure that you get near your affordable housing target. We don't really want to be in that position. We want to be able to actually say, in response to those developers, actually, we've got a good policy, we are delivering affordable housing, we are addressing our housing waiting list. So if I can move on to the recommendation on page 212, and I just want to suggest a correction because I believe you've got A, B as the as the recommendations. Please take them as A, B, C and D. But A is to consider the content of the housing strategy, and if you have any comments on that, we can feed those back to our housing officers before it's reported back to Cabinet for their final approval. B, to note the current position in respect of affordable housing delivery. And I've included a fair bit of detail actually within the main body of the report about how much we've delivered, where affordable housing is expected to come from in different locations. C, consider and approve the suggested amendments to policy LP5. And what you'll see, again, what I've done is provided a tracked change version of the policy on page 311, so you can see clearly how officers are suggesting that that policy could be amended. And then authorise the head of planning, that shouldn't say officers, but head of planning, perhaps in consultation with the chairman, I might suggest, to put forward the suggested amendments to policy LP5 to the planning inspector for their consideration when we come to the examination of the section 2 local plan. And that's me done, Chairman. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Guyver. Excellent as always. Any questions? Councillor Stevenson? I'd be most unimpressed if you didn't have one.
Am I getting that reputation, am I? Okay, so just so that I can understand it, the reason why we went with the gifted units was because we felt at the time when we made this stance that the housing associations and everything else, there wasn't the demand to buy the affordable housing. I didn't hear you say that's changed. So that was the first point. Of the 180 gifted units that we've got currently standing there, I think we're not expecting very many of them, are we, in the next 5 years, even though it says 5 years. I think at the moment we're currently looking at 3 for just this year. And when it comes to the actual policy, why have we removed all planning applications that include residential development of 11 or more net dwellings must include an affordable housing statement? Thank you very much, Chairman.
Mr. Guyver. Thank you, Councillor Stevenson.
Thank you. No, some excellent points raised there. If I take the last one first, essentially anyone that submits an application which is liable for an affordable housing requirement sets out in their design and access statement or their general planning statement how they're providing affordable housing. We've learnt from experience that actually they don't tend to submit an individual statement on its own, but it is covered within the documentation that they do submit. So it's not, we don't tend to see something with affordable housing statement written on it, but we do tend to have all of the information that we're required to determine the applications as part of that. So that's the only real reason that's come out. The change, sorry, if I take the other point about the 180 units that are expected, they will be phased within those developments. So a development will have to reach a certain number of market housing completions before the affordable houses are transferred over to the council. Now, for those sites that are perhaps only just commenced, it probably won't be this next financial year that they reach that trigger point. It will possibly be the year after that or the year after that. So I think what you'll see is a curve that sort of goes up gently, and then sort of 2 to 3 years it will peak. But we are expecting, as long as those developments take place along the trajectories that we expect, we should take receipt of all of those affordable units within the next 5 years. But initially, while they're building the market houses, they won't be required to transfer anything until they reach a certain point within their market delivery. To respond to the point about why we reverted to a situation where we were taking gifted units, there was a couple of issues at the time. Really, the council was keen that we take control of our own housing stock and not reliant on housing associations to provide affordable housing. Two, there was a change in the way that housing associations were funded and how they could claim rent, and that had an impact on their economic viability. And whereas before we would have had housing associations happy to take dwellings off of the main developers as part of their stock, they found that they didn't have the finance to be able to do it because the policy had changed at a government level, and that filtered down to their level and prevented them from making the investments that they used to be able to make. That situation has been reversed. The government has reviewed its rent policy, and as a result of that, housing associations do now have access to the finance that they need to be able to take on board affordable housing at a discounted level that they couldn't do 2 or 3 years ago. And we need to make sure that they do. And there's a number of schemes actually within the district that are set out in the tables in here where they've actually bought a whole site, housing association, a couple in Harwich in particular, where they've actually managed to access the finances to be able to deliver a whole affordable housing scheme in Harwich. A couple of years ago they wouldn't have been able to do that because the conditions weren't right for them.
Thank you. Before you come back, Councillor Stevenson, or I ask you to come back, Mrs Hastings would like to give us some information on gifted units. Yeah, of course.
I just wanted to comment on the number of completions on the gifted units. So it is correct that they are, because of the phasing, they are now starting to be received. My team are working with developers, solicitors on transfers for new gifted units. It's definitely, we've 3 are about to complete. We've got another 5 in the pipeline. That is definitely a work stream that is increasing because the developers are starting to reach those phases. So just wanted to sort of highlight that it's something that I'm aware of that we will be receiving more over definitely the coming months.
Thank you, Mrs Hastings. Councillor Stevenson.
Thank you, Chairman. Okay, so probably me just being paranoid. New problem then. How long is it taking for a gifted unit to come through the system? If we're taking our current need from the housing register, that housing need would change over the period of time. Does that coincide with the same period for the gifted units?
Thank you. I mean, they don't correspond very neatly. I think the key thing here is that we need to maximise the amount we deliver off of sites that do come forward, because even with these gifted units coming forward, yes, they're going to make a massive difference to the lives of the people that go into those properties, but the whole time that we're delivering low levels of affordable housing, the need is going to just increase. So hence the need to ensure that we try and achieve that 30% affordable housing as best as we can on the remainder of the sites that come forward.
Yeah, okay, come back, please. Do remember that the policy states it's not absolute, the 30%, is seeking 30%. And there is a major difference there.
Would it not be better to take our need from the reports that we had about, because, for instance, we've only got 11 3-bedroom houses, and it was identified that we need 1-bedroom and 3-bedroom properties in the report, yet sometimes our housing need doesn't reflect that. And we've got a mixed match of everything going on that allows these inequalities to stay in place. And if we went and got the 3 and the 1, it would probably solve our two situation, if you know what I mean. Thank you.
Sorry.
Well, when we get applications and we are looking to secure the affordable housing percentage, the other discussions that happen behind the scenes are actually with our colleagues in the housing department, who will actually consult the housing register to see what the need for that particular area is. So if there is an express need for, say, 2-bedroom properties in a certain area, what we will do is we'll consult with our colleagues in the housing team, and through the Section 106 obligation, we will actually try and settle on a mix of dwellings that are provided as part of the affordable housing. So if there is a particular need for, say, 2-bedroom houses, we try and pin that down through the terms of the Section 106. And we also require the developer to provide a specification for those dwellings as well. And that specification has got to adhere to the mix of dwellings that the council has advised on.
Councillor Allen?
Chairman, I'm trying to get my head around this affordable housing bit. You know, is that the way we talk in here, we're subservient to developers. You know, it's near enough. Everything's a gift from them. We have to wait for the houses to be built before we get them. We've got to do this, do that. I'm positive. Is this the same across the whole of the country, or is it just in tendering? Because all I can say is my experience of working in London in big units of private flats and private apartments is that the local council come in and they want near enough one whole floor is social housing, and with that you have your own entrance, everything, and the social housing is near enough built first before they start on the flats. And I just feel this 30% up to 30%, we've really got to be robust with this, because we're not going to get it. Gifting house is great. We're talking about 3 and 5. Whereas 150 is not going to come in 5 years. It's just, I just think the councils, as I said before, is getting the developers are getting the breast of the chicken, and we're getting the parson's nose here. We should be more robust and saying that, you know, we want these. We don't want to wait till you sell them. We want these houses now, and then you can have your building. If you go into Spain and places like that, they make the developers do most of the community and social stuff before they start on the private stuff. You go in the Balearic Islands, they have to build all the roads, everything has to be done, all the community stuff before. Why aren't we robust like that? And the other, just one more thing, just getting round. We say it's 11 or more, they have to give us 30%. Well, surely that's all he does is he only builds 10 and then waits a year and then puts planning permission on for the little bit of land that's in there. I mean, it's so open that they seem to be on the right-hand side all the time, and we're following them. Perhaps I've got it all wrong, and I'm just looking at taking a layman's view on this, of what it looks like out there.
Mr. Allen, Mr. Guyver?
Certainly. Some very good points raised there. I mean, in response to the very first question you asked, is this the same across the country? It's very similar across the country. I think London operates in quite a different way, and I think there is more sort of subsidy available to authorities in London to deliver a lot of affordable housing early. But what generally tends to happen with private-led house builder schemes is that they will start to build the private housing to generate cash flow to then, in order to be in a viable position to provide the affordable housing. The key is making sure that you set the trigger for that affordable housing at the right level. But that is common across the country. When it's privately led, the developer needs to get a cash flow going before they can install the affordable housing. But we've had examples in the past where we've managed to secure the affordable housing early because finances and grants were available early. So St John's Road, Clacton is an example, actually, where the affordable housing came first, because the economic conditions for market house building weren't particularly strong at the time, but there was subsidy available for affordable homes, and they brought those forward long before the market houses were built, but that was subsidised. Talking of infrastructure more generally, I mean, what we're trying to do with the garden community is an example of where we are trying to implement the infrastructure first, so we're not held to ransom by a developer promising everything and not delivering it at a later date. So there's an example of where we're trying to take an infrastructure first approach. So there's an example there where affordable housing has come forward early, but on the whole, if it's private sector led, they have to deliver a certain number of market units before they achieve the cash flow to then be able to transfer the affordable. That's quite common across the country. The 10 or 11 unit threshold, they'll just build 10 and then they'll apply for another load later and try and get away with that. We've had a couple of cases where developers have clearly tried to do that. And again, St John's Road, Clacton, different site altogether, different part of St John's Road, where the developer got planning permission for 14 dwellings. And at that time, the affordable housing threshold was 15. So it was a bit higher, so they didn't need to provide affordable housing. They started building their 14 dwellings and then applied for a further, I think it was 10 or 15, on the land that they controlled immediately behind it. And what we said is, oh, wait up a minute, if you'd have built all of that in one go, or applied for it in one go, we would have required 30% affordable housing. So what we refused planning permission on that basis because they were clearly trying to wriggle out the affordable housing provision. They went to appeal and the inspector supported us. So the inspector upheld our decision. So we do keep an eye out for that, and we try and stop developers that are trying to not sneak out of it by coming in with little phases of development. So we are alive to that, and we try and prevent that from happening.
Thank you, Mr. Guyver. Any other comments? Councillor Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm interested in what you said about specifications on gifted housing. Do we have controls on that, or do we do it on an ad hoc basis where a developer is going to give us one property, say, one dwelling, and then we can say, oh, could you possibly change that specification? Because I know of one property in my ward where it's going to be gifted at some point in the future, and the council has asked the developer to put a washroom and ramps and things like that. So is that just a common policy across all our gifted housing, or do we have, say, a developer gives us a 3-bedroom house and that they're going to build it, they want to build it, but do we have some control on the gifted housing? That's what I'm interested in, because I think if we're going to have, say, our aspiration to have 180 houses gifted to us, I would like us to have some control on whether they're going to have wet rooms, whether they're going to be on the, how big the gardens are, or grab rails and things like that. They're the kind of things I want to know, and I'm quite encouraged what you said, but I just want to know whether you can elaborate a bit more, please.
Yep, happy to do so. So with the gifted unit schemes, on the majority of cases, we've had a fairly standard specification, setting out the absolute minimum of what we require, but that does reflect the needs that we're looking to address on our waiting list. So part of the Section 106 agreement will be that the developer has to agree a specification with the council before they can start the development normally. It's normally prior to the commencement or prior to the commencement of or occupation of the housing. So yeah, we do have the control, because if we're not happy with that specification, then they don't tick that box of the Section 106 agreement, and they legally won't be able to occupy any of the development. I don't know of any specific examples other than the one you've spoken about where we've got a particularly specialist kind of specification we've gone for. A lot of the ones I've dealt with have been fairly standard, but yes, we have the control. We're essentially the client in that situation. We are the purchaser for £1 of that dwelling, so we want to ensure that that dwelling is to our satisfaction.
I welcome that, I really do. In the previous administration, I think Councillor Baker brought up a comment at the Planning Committee that he noticed that the gifted housing that were proposed to be given over by a developer, the size of the gardens were predominantly smaller because of the other properties were private, but the gifted ones, the garden areas were predominantly smaller. And Councillor Baker at the time felt that was unfair to gift houses where the gardens are predominantly smaller, and whether we have control of that too.
Okay, so certainly, I mean, when we come to determine an application, if we as a council are not satisfied that the plot or the design or the appearance of the dwelling is up to muster, then we can refuse or defer position. And the examples of the committee where it came forward, the councillor was concerned that it looked like the developer was cutting corners on that particular plot. I think that one was deferred. I think they revised it, and then we accepted the revised version. So there's two stages, really. There's one by which we have to approve the planning for it and be satisfied that whatever garden size or design has been provided is satisfactory. But there's another stage when we actually have the specification following the Section 106 agreement where our housing department have to agree that, yep, that's what we want to see in terms of its internal dimensions and bathrooms and things like that.
Councillor Stevenson.
Just a quickie, please, Chairman. Policy LP5, we've removed all the wording that relates to the council. Do we need our own policy, bearing in mind that we've got our own bills going on now?
Not specifically, because council housing comes under the definition of affordable housing, and this is just a case of simplifying it, because there's a whole range of things now under the government definition, which I've included in the report, which you can count as affordable housing, and council housing is but one of those.
Everybody, any other questions? No. Could I have a proposer? No. Thank you, Councillor Scott. Seconder? Thank you, Councillor. And all those in favour, please show. Thank you. Unanimous again. Once more. Thank you very much. Right. Move onwards and upwards and downwards. Right. Item 8. Town centre planning, policies and regeneration schemes. To report progress on the Council's regeneration projects for Clacton, Dovercourt town centres and their implications for policies proposals for the emerging local plan. B, to suggest possible amendments to the planning policies in the emerging local plan relating to town centre uses aimed at allowing a more flexible range of activities in response to the changing role and function of town centres. The decline of the traditional retail on the high street and the government changes to use classes order. This is something to get our heads around. And finally, to seek the committee's agreement for the suggested amendments to be put forward for the planning inspector's consideration when they come to examine the Section 2 of the local plan. And Mr. Marshall? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good evening. Answering Councillor Turner's point, it's coming up to Christmas. So as elected members, you should instruct officers to raise the finance, to buy a turkey and cut the best bits off for tendering in the housing proposal. That's for the last affordable homes. If you want the best, you've got to go and get it. It's a shame members of the public can't contribute to the arguments or statements after or during the speaking of the councillors. Thank you very much. Right, town centre planning policies. This is only 5 pages, 6 pages long. The government's white paper fixing our broken housing market, February 2017, and the New Town Act 2018 And the recent revised permitted development legislation shows that this is a very fluid area, and I believe the committee should delay any recommendations until after the Section 1 examination has taken place, re-examination, and found sound. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall. Hi. Once again, Mr. Guyver, please.
Thank you, Chairman. So if I start by setting a bit of background, really, there's several things happening with our town centres. They're changing rapidly. There's a lot more trade moves online, a lot more services move online. And there is a concern, this is nationally, indeed globally, that town centres are changing. And in the future, they're not going to necessarily be a hub for just retail activity. They're going to have to diversify and provide a range of services, facilities, attractions if they're going to remain as town centres in the future. This council recognised quite early on that this was going to be an issue, particularly for two of our town centres, Clacton and for Dovercourt. And the Cabinet has considered and approved reports containing actions that the councils are looking to implement within those two particular town centres. Very briefly, on Clacton Town Centre, following work that was done by the Clacton Town Centre Working Party, the council and Clacton has been shortlisted on the government's Future High Streets Fund, which is a substantial funding opportunity to enable town centres to change their offer, to modernise, to transform, so that they are resilient to future changes. So projects are being worked up for Clacton Town Centre, working with Essex County Council, looking at delivering some key developments in the town centre and attracting government funding. There are also a number of shorter-term schemes that the council is looking to implement in the town centre, aimed at improving parking, aimed at improving the branding of the town centre, and also measures aimed at getting footfall up and making the town centre a more attractive place to go. Similarly, at Dovercourt Town Centre, a master plan has been produced by consultants and agreed by the Cabinet for Dovercourt, and one of the key interventions there is looking at the redundant sites within the town centre, namely the Starling site, and looking at a mixed-use scheme that will deliver improved parking, residential, all aimed at really smartening up that town centre and improving its fortunes going forward. The details of those reports, there is a hyperlink within the report which you can either type into the internet or click it if you're looking online, and the full details of the reports are available. But a substantial amount of money has been put aside to deliver projects in Clacton and Dovercourt, and there's some really exciting opportunities going forward. As part of the discussions on Clacton Town Centre in particular with the Working Party, there was a concern that actually current planning policies that seek to protect town centre units for predominantly A1 retail use could potentially have the effect of leading to lots of properties becoming empty and vacant because they weren't flexible enough to allow alternatives to be accommodated within the units, whether that be restaurants, cafes, museums, estate agents, a whole range of things. The current policies in our draft local plan seek to protect the majority of units within our town centres for A1 retail. But A1 retail on our high streets is something that is in decline and is projected to decline into the future. So that calls for a more flexible approach. Now, our friends, our partners, our businesses working on the Clacton Working Group spotted that early on, but it was also reflected in changes that the government wanted to bring forward to the planning rules. And one of the changes they brought forward earlier this year was to change the use classes order. Now, the use classes order is something that planners use to determine whether a change of use from one use to another requires planning permission or not. Now, historically, if you were in A1 retail use, if you wanted to change to anything else, you had to get planning permission to do it. And the government were concerned that that was constraining the market and that run the risk of these A1 units becoming vacant within our town centres. They did a consultation last year, which this committee actually had an input into, about making more flexible changes to the use class order, including allowing A1 retail to change to A2 financial and professional services. So it includes things like estate agents, things like accountants, solicitors, to A3 food and drink, so you're looking at your restaurants, cafes, and B1 office business use. And they did the consultation and they made those changes earlier this year, which means now you can change from A1 retail use to any of those other uses without the need for planning permission for a 3-year temporary period, within which time you'd be expected to apply for planning permission and get it from the council if you wanted to continue beyond that 3 years. Also, the National Planning Policy Framework, as amended by the 2019 version, places at its heart having more flexible and responsive approach to business opportunities within our town centres. So reflecting on all of that, we believe that the policies that we've currently got in our emerging local plan are outdated in their current form because they're seeking to rigorously protect something that is on the decline. So what we've suggested here is that whereas the current policies actually define primary and secondary shopping frontages, where non-A1 retail use is restricted to a certain percentage, the suggestion here is that we remove those protected frontages and allow a more flexible range of uses to take place within our town centres to ensure that they are responsive to market demand, to ensure that they don't decline in the face of a decline in retail sector, and to ensure that we could be more responsive in the future. So the suggestion for the town centre policy, which is on page 315, a much simplified version, which essentially allows A1, A2, A3 and B1 uses within town centre to interchange without the need to apply for planning permission. They don't need to. They can apply. They don't need planning permission now, but if they apply for planning permission, we would allow that to happen.
Clarify something. Just a thought. Does this apply to all A1, all class uses you've mentioned? So if there's in a little village somewhere, they suddenly wanted to change, would they be able to have the 3-year temporary, or is it only to designated high street areas?
No, it's all. So an A1 use in any location could revert to an A2 use for a temporary 3-year period, notwithstanding their location.
Sorry to throw the curveball, but I thought it was best that we made sure we didn't shoot ourselves in the hip somewhere further up the line. Thank you. No. Okay.
I'm still going at the moment. So the main change that we're suggesting to this policy is to take away protected primary and secondary shopping frontages so that a more flexible range of uses would be allowed within the town centre. For Clacton Town Centre specifically, there's also a suggested change to the boundary of the town centre and the primary shopping area within its core And that really comes from the recommendations and the suggestions of the Clacton Town Centre Working Party, where there was a concern that the area shown covered a huge expanse of area and didn't really reflect the core of the town centre where commercial activity should be located. So if I show you on page 325, what we've got there is the boundary of the town centre, the shopping area and the key shopping frontages as shown in the emerging local plan as it stands at the moment. And if you turn over to page 326, what is being suggested there is that we change the area so it covers a much smaller area within the town centre and take away the primary and secondary protected shopping frontages. Therefore, you are pushing commercial activity towards the core of the town centre and allowing more flexibility at the same time. And that came out of the discussions with the Clacton Working Party, including local businesses as well as other stakeholders. So if I can then take you to the recommendation, which is on page 316. Thank you, Councillor. So the recommendation is that the committee notes the progress of the regeneration projects for Clacton and Dovercourt Town Centre, which I've got to say are looking very positive indeed, and I think we're very much in line with where we need to go in terms of those projects, and very much in line with government thinking as well, and the opportunities for attracting funding to projects like these are very strong at the moment. B, to note the latest position in respect of government policy on town centres, including changes to the National Planning Policy Framework and the Use Classes Order, which very much point to having a more flexible, responsive approach to our town centres. C, consider and approve the suggested amendments, which I've set out there for policy PP5. And as with the other reports, I've set out a tracked change version of the policy, and that is on page 329. And specific amendments to Clacton Town Centre, which you saw on pages 325 to 326. And changes to other proposals, maps. And essentially what I'm saying here, and I've included copies of the maps within the appendices from page 331, is that the primary and secondary shopping frontages, we're suggesting that they should be taken off the maps in the local plan, so they're not constraining those areas to A1 use. And D, authorising the head of planning, and I'd suggest in consultation with the chairman, to put forward those suggested amendments to the policies and the relevant maps to the planning inspector for their consideration as part of the examination of the Section 2 plan. And before I just finish, I thought it might be an opportunity to pick up on Mr Marshall's point about deferring any decision on this until we've got a decision on Section 1 of the plan. Please bear in mind what we are doing here is discussing what changes we think ought to be made to these policies. We're not changing them right now. We are considering changes that we will suggest to the inspector as part of the Section 2 examination when that happens. And that will be following the completion of Section 1. But it's a big plan, there's a lot of policies in it, and I think considering them early and not leaving it all to the last minute is probably quite prudent, bearing in mind the timescales involved in these kind of things. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr Guyver. Councillor Allen?
Yeah, this,
when people change from A1 to whatever, they're allowed to do it on a temporary basis of 3 years. Can there be, I don't know if the words, appeals or people object to that, objections? Because it seems that during that 3 years they can get planning permission, it stays like that. So that it would never go back to A1 unless someone else comes in. Why I ask is about the cluster. You can get a cluster of estate agents, lawyers, solicitors and things like this. And likewise, the cluster of half a dozen coffee shops next to each other, and it removes the footfall, because it seems to me that we're going to attract loads of commercial businesses there, which are not going to get footfall, because unless you're going to go to a solicitor, why would you want to window shop a solicitor, or an accountant's office? And it is the clusters and the commercials. And I can't get my head this 3 year. Are they sort of going to be deemed, well, if you're there 3 years, you can keep it as A1, or can there be objections to that? Yeah. Oh.
Thank you. So as it stands, you can change the use from A1 to, say, A2, estate agent, without needing to apply for planning permission, but you only have that use for 3 years. So it's expected that within those 3 years, they would have to apply for planning permission to make it permanent. And if they don't, they would be in breach of planning, and we could potentially take enforcement action against them. But what we're saying here is, at the moment, if they got their 3-year temporary permission and applied to keep it permanent, against the current policies, they're quite restrictive. So we might want to say, well, no, we think you need to go back to A1 because our policy says that we want as much A1 in the town centre as possible. What we're suggesting with these amendments is that we would be more flexible, so that if they changed use and applied for permission to make it permanent within the 3 years, there's a better chance that we would actually say yes, because we want more diversity and bigger range of uses. I think the concern about clustering is a perfectly valid one to make, and that is the side effect, the potential side effect of taking the constraint off. And I sort of make no bones about that. That is a potential problem that could arise. But in reality, commercial businesses tend to operate in a manner by which they're most viable. And if you get too many of the same thing in one location, that can affect their viability overall. So the market generally tends to give you a mix of uses within the town centre. Things like estate agents and solicitors are the kind of businesses that, along with retail, are increasingly going online. And are perhaps going to have less of a presence in the high street in the future. But things like food and drink that you can't do online, you can't drink a cup of coffee online, well, not at the moment anyway, you might be able to do it in the future, might beam it through to you, but where you have to physically go out and eat something, drink something, see a show, see something happening, they're the kind of uses that we need to encourage in our town centres if they're going to become viable in the future. And lifting some of the constraints will allow us to be more responsive to that.
Right, having said that, I mean, as you say, everyone's going online. So what I see as a future is that we can have, I keep referencing back to London because I mean, that's where I go a lot, is that you've got a town centre and there's sort of 10 nail bars, one that does your eyes, one that does half a dozen tattoo shops, and it's all sort of hairdressers and stuff like that. It's purely a service. It's going to be for service, not for shopping. And but I didn't mean, on your change in food and drink, there was no mention of hairdressers or anything like that. So what would they come under? It's A2. Yeah. It's just that in a local town this week, actually, I think unbeknownst to both of them, there's hairdressers opened up next to another one, and they're both opened up this, you know, and so, and yet this same council refused planning permission to put a physiotherapist on a high street because you would go to, you can't get that online. Yeah. So.
We do remember, I've always considered that we're the high tide mark here in tendering. We're the last to get it and the first to lose it. And if you look at further up the A12, you'll see what's happening to their high streets, and that's what's likely, that's what could happen and may well happen to our high streets. And this is just a way of us actually being forward-thinking and in line with, obviously, government policy, that we've got to be a little more, I suppose, less constrained in our use classes. And we have actually done an incredibly good job of keeping our use classes and not allowing clustering and keeping a very good varied selection so people are attracted to our high streets, which is actually reflected in the high occupancy rates we have at our high streets. But as I come back to, and we've argued this behind the scenes quite heftily, but I come back to the fact that I do know we're the last to get it and the first to lose it, so it hasn't hit us fully.
Yeah, but the reason we control it
It's not to have a town council. They don't see the benefits that we see, Councillor Allen. Anyway, anything else? I'll come to you in a moment, Councillor Broderick. Where's my list? Councillor Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I totally support what Councillor Allen was saying about clustering and stuff, but I was, in the back of my mind, I was thinking about bookmakers and betting shops, and I was led to believe you were restricted to how many you could have in bookmakers. And the government are coming down heavily on betting shops and large scale betting in betting shops. And I was wondering, I'm sure the back of my mind, going back say 15 years, there was something about we couldn't have too many betting shops in one area. The other thing is, I assume it on P5, the policy exhibition halls. I assume that means also conference centres, or is that? Because I know that in other seaside towns like Torquay and Bournemouth and Brighton and places like that, they have a conference centre. And I think going back 15 odd years when I became a district councillor, there was a long-term aspiration to have a conference centre here in Clapton. And I don't, yeah.
With a bridge going across the hotel, remember?
Yeah,
those were the days.
My point is, if we're going to have this, money coming in from the government of 50 town centres across the country and getting this future high streets fund, we need to possibly look at and maybe a small conference centre or something to accommodate these small groups. May want a conference, like for example Lib Dems who might want a conference down at Clapton.
I agree, because there's no more telephone boxes left, so where are they going to be?
Yeah, we're obviously Council Allen hasn't seen lately that we've gone up in numbers, so we probably need a larger place, the bigger than the phone box, and somewhere in Clapton might actually do wonders for that. And I was wondering whether is there room for that. Could you answer though the bookmakers situation?
So what was your question, Councillor?
Well,
do you want us to propose a conference centre?
Well, when I first got elected here, there was talk. I think Councillor Allen was the leader at the time.
But it's not actually talking to the subjects.
No, I know, but I want to ask about the like betting shops. I was led to believe there was a restriction on how many betting shops you could have.
Could offer you Marks and Spencers.
No, thank you to Councillor Scott. Thank you. I mean, in that policy PP5 on 315, in that second paragraph, what is allowed in terms of different uses reflects very closely the use classes that the government have changed. So you'd allow A1 retail, A2 professional and financial services, A3 food and drink, B1 business, public libraries, exhibition halls, which could include conference centres, museums, clinics or health centres. Betting shops falls outside of what the government would allow to change without the need for planning permission. So they would most certainly need planning permission anyway. And we're not specifically supporting those as part of this policy. In terms of delivering a conference facility for Clacton, the Clacton Town Centre Working Party, who've met over the course of the last year or so, have come up with a whole range of ideas which we're trying to incorporate into our bid for the future High Street funds. So I'll be working very closely with ward members from Clacton Town Centre and the Clacton area to look at that in more detail later this week, in fact. And certainly having a conference, exhibition, arts centre kind of thing is certainly on the list of things that would be great for the town.
I welcome what you just said about the betting shops, though, because I think having too many betting shops cause more problems than it's worth, and unfortunately, it's vulnerable people that actually will, in my view, will lose out because of too many betting shops.
Could I just say, Chairman, that takeaways are also excluded from the government changes of uses as well, because they cause a lot of concern as well. No.
In quiet rural areas.
Yep. No, thank you, Councillor Broderick. No, I completely understand. As well as planning and whether something changes from use, from A1 to an A3 use, there's also the licensing rules, which are quite separate from planning. And the licensing rules will look more closely at things like, extraction, the kind of goods that could be cooked on site and that kind of thing as well. So as well as the planning, which controls the use of a unit, there's also licensing, which looks at ensuring that it's a good neighbour to people that live in the area. So it is a consideration. And one of the issues that often comes up is ventilation flues and things like that from kitchens, and the smell of food that comes out of those and how that affects residential areas. So that is certainly a consideration. Turning to parking in Clacton Town Centre, you'll be delighted that is something that the working party has been looking at very closely, and something that the new ambassadors group for Clacton Town Centre will continue to look at, because it's one of the key issues that local businesses have raised with us. And we're trying to see whether we can do something on a short-term basis to assist with parking, but also through the Future High Streets Fund, something a bit more radical, which makes the town centre more accessible to people that want to drive in. Because one of the issues that residents have raised is that a lot of people are put off because they think they're not going to get parked if they come. We want to eliminate that concern, so people feel that they can come into the town centre because they feel that they will get parked. The issue about residential accommodation above shops, you're absolutely on point, Councillor Broderick, because that is another one of the recommendations that came out of the work of the Working Party to encourage more residential development on upper floors, because it does support the vitality and viability of a town centre and footfall. And it's also something that the government did as part of their consultation as well, encouraging more residential use. The wording that's included in there is really to recognise that in a town centre, it's not always practical or possible to meet our normal standards of parking provision or garden sizes. So therefore, in a town centre, we might need to take a more flexible approach. And the wording is actually designed to do that, because it suggests that we need to have an adequate level of parking and amenity space. And in reality, we'd on their own merits, we would look at them on their own merits. If they're right in the core of the town centre, it might be that they don't need any parking really at all, because they're right in the heart of where everything's going on. And if they're in an area where you can't physically create garden space, we probably wouldn't insist on it in those locations. But you need to consider it wherever it happens. But in town centres, we're likely to be more flexible.
Yes. Yeah.
Parking outside your house or nearby, even when you live in the town centre and you live over the shop. And I was just worried that you would be taking up some space for shoppers. So basically, that's you've sorted the concern. If that's as I'm understanding PP5. Yes. Thank you.
Any other comments? Do I have a proposer? Thank you, Councillor Scott. And a seconder? Thank you, Councillor Chapman. All those in favour, please show. Thank you. Unanimity again. Thank you very much. I keep looking at it and thinking we've been going for 3 hours. It feels like it, I agree. It's only been 2 hours. 2 hours. Would anyone like a comfort break? We've just got 2 items to go. No? Okay, fine, we'll plough on. All right, item 9. Report of the Corporate Director of Planning and Regeneration Draft Heritage Strategy. Now, this is for noting and for our comments to go forward to the Cabinet. Any comments we choose to make, because it is a whole strategy, but it is only part of a whole policy. So I've come on, Councillor, I'll just give a little preamble into it. I forgot the page number now. That's on page 337. 337. So, all right, Mr. Guyver.
Thank you very much indeed. As the Chairman rightly said, this is an item for noting and for comments, really, to come back to us. In planning circles, we're very familiar that we have a duty to preserve and enhance our heritage and listed buildings, ancient monuments, but there's not really that great a push to actually positively promote them and to celebrate them. And really, this is what the draft heritage strategy is about. It's been prepared by our colleagues in Essex Place Services, and once finalised can be adopted as a council-wide strategy, and it contains a range of actions aimed at positively promoting our heritage. So we're working with Place Services to undertake public consultation in the coming weeks, and details of that will come out in due course once they've been finalised. But you'll be pleased to know, members, that you're the first really to see this. So you get the first opportunity to have a look and to feedback some comments. When the just before the official consultation starts, a notification will go to all of our members, so we will be inviting comments from all members in due course. But you're the first to see this. So any comments that we do get back, either today or through the consultation, we'll look at, we'll take them into account before we seek formal approval from the Cabinet to adopt it as a council strategy. And there are other strategies being produced as well on culture and tourism. Okay, so the document itself begins on page 343 within your agenda. And the document really contains a number of parts. The first part is a baseline, which contains an assessment of Tendering's historic environment and identifies some of its key features, including its archaeology, historic landscapes, rural towns, villages, coastal towns, seaside resorts, and identifies heritage at risk as well, which includes some of our conservation areas and Martello Towers and important listed buildings. It also identifies key organisations and community groups who play an important role in looking after and promoting our heritage, and that we need to work more closely with in the future. Part 2 of this strategy contains a number of priorities for action. Sorry, Kath, can I have some more water? Sorry. Including updating conservation area appraisals, and that work's already underway, so we're reviewing all our conservation areas and seeing whether the boundaries need to be extended, where there are particular actions in those areas that we should undertake. Thank you. Updating guidance booklets for conservation areas and listed buildings. Establishing a local list. I think this is quite an interesting one. We have the statutory national list of listed buildings, but you can have a local list of buildings that aren't necessarily on the national list, but if they are of particular historic significance, they can go onto a local list, and through the current version of the national framework, we can actually give that some weight in decision making when it comes to planning, which we couldn't do historically. So I think that will be of great interest, particularly to our town and parish councils, I should think. We're working more closely with communicating with organisations, community groups, schools, museums and other partners to try and do what we can to positively promote our heritage. More education and training courses relating to conservation and the historic environment. Events and festivals to celebrate the district's heritage. I think what's happening in Harwich in terms of Mayflower and historic Harwich is an example of the kind of thing that can be done elsewhere. And through the Clacton Town Centre project as well, one of the key recommendations coming from that is to actually promote and celebrate the history of the town and incorporate that within any developments that take place. Improvements to signage and information boards. There's a whole raft of recommendations in there within the strategy, not all related to planning. Some of them would be outside of planning but delivered through other services of the council, working with partners. Section 3 of this document includes a case study, an example of Old Harwich and what measures could be put in place to protect and enhance and promote its unique heritage. So really, yes, this item is for your consideration and comments. So if I can take you to page 338, the recommendation is there that the committee notes the content of the draft heritage strategy, agrees any comments, if any, to be reported to Cabinet as part of its consultation on the strategy. But as I said before, if there are comments that follow this meeting, all members will be invited to make comments on this. So if you don't necessarily have comments right here, right now, as part of the committee, you can make comments separately. Chairman, that's me done on that report.
Thank you, Mr. Guy. Mr. Marshall, would you like to come? Would you like to, comments you wish to make known?
Thank you very much. Good evening. I suggest that officers put this members put this report on the back burner so that officers can concentrate on more pressing issues like Section 1 and Section 2. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Allen, did you want to come in? Any comments? I've got Councillor Chapman. Oh, did I see you? Yeah. I'll come to you next, Councillor Chapman. Thank you. And then Councillor Scott. Thank you.
I've been interested in since odd years ago, and did loads of travelling around looking at different sites, so I agree with what we're doing, and we have let it go. Some of the sites that we looked at and that have been looked at now is the ones in Harwich, the Fort, the Redoubt, and all them places. But perhaps my concerns are not of the buildings we've got and what we need to do with those, because we all know what they need to be renovated with wherever grant money and that. But you use the term key organisations we want to work with and community groups. If I could just go through the action list, promoting healthy heritage, it's great, yeah. And then helping existing attractions reach full potential. Now, we can't do that when we've got these heritage organisations. There's one in Walton as an example that have been happily going along, loads of visitors, interested people with the lifeboat in it and all that. But then they get a notice from the district council saying they're quadrupled or more their rent. So consequently, the landlord's going to shut down. The landlord who wants to do this is going to shut down the Heritage Society, the heritage place in Walton. And so what happens to that building? Now, hopefully it's not going to be, say, like it's happened to a lot of other things around here, that, oh, no one wants it, it's run down, we sell it. Because that centre there, so I use it as an example, fulfils most of the, except for the technology one, because I think technology don't come into it, but it's the lifeboat station at Walton really needs to be considered, and whether this council wants to be the sort of sheriff of Nottingham and shut it down. therefore losing a key organisation plus a community group, and really it goes right against your penultimate bullet point, which is helping existing attractions reach their full potential. The other stuff is, I agree with it, and all we need to do is move forward. Mr. Marshall's got a point that we have got pressing things, but it's like everything. We need to move along with this as well, because all those people that are going to have them houses that everyone wants have got to have leisure time, and they've got to have some thing to look at our areas, not just housing estates. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Allen. It's actually something I also picked up and feel very strongly about. Now, it's one of the things we can pass on. I mean, it's like a lot of these things, is unintended consequences. And I gather from my memory that the government has insisted that local authorities do not gift or give away public assets. They have to be an open market valuation. And as a duty, I gather they have to do. Now, obviously, somewhere along the line, there's probably a catch-all that says, well, actually, in certain cases, you can't. But one of the things we have noted is that local organisations that have taken on redundant buildings, turn them into something useful, then suddenly they get a commercial rent. Well, it makes the whole enterprise a complete waste. So obviously that's one of the comments that we'd like to send back. If I ask you, can I ask one of the officers please to make note of these comments and then read them back to us at the end of the debate? Would that be all right? Thank you very much. Mr. Guyver, would you like to make any other comments? Well, that was a first, thank you. No, Katie. Yes, I've got that, yeah. Right. Councillor Chapman.
Page 396, you've got Thorrington Tide Mill. I can tell you that Essex County Council have just sold it and it's now privately owned and not open to the public. So that will have to be removed, which is a shame. Other than that, I think it's a very good document.
That was one of the comments that Councillor Chapman has brought up, but because Thorrington's in my ward and obviously Councillor Wiggins's ward. But there are things in here that are important, and without our history, then we wouldn't have people visiting our district because of the history. People are Roman fanatics, people who are like Bronze Age, Iron Age. And as a history graduate myself, history is so important for the well-being of our future communities. Having said this, I note on page 380 they mentioned the ruins of Church of St Peter's, Alresford. It should be 11th century rather than 13th century. And also they mention from brickwork. Well, yes, the brickwork was Roman, but it was from the ruins of the Roman villa on the river, where they used to have a Roman villa. And it was in ruins, so they moved the bricks up to build the church. That would have been interesting if they had that in the description.
There's about 5 centuries between the Romans leaving and the church.
Yeah, I know, but it should really say it, not just from Roman. Not just say Roman brick. What's really interesting is I don't see in here about the protection of our railway buildings in terms of our station houses. For example, there was a famous architect who built 5 station houses on the Walton line. Alresford was the first house that built in 1855, and it went right along to Bentley and Wheeley and so on. And at one point, they started to demolish Great Bentley's house, and they realised it was in the conservation area, and they've got to rebuild it again. So there are issues like that where it's not consistent, and I think Essex County Council should really seriously speak to Network Rail in terms of protecting our railway heritage, especially in the south, where you've got railway line going across from Alresford through Thorrington and onwards to Walton and Frinton. In terms of Alresford and its long historical industry of gravel extraction, there are the old gravel workings, about 150 to almost 200 years old, not completely 200 years old, but almost. There are workings that are fixed, that they used to transport the gravel to the barges on the creek and take it out. And there's no mention of protecting those kind of historical gravel extractions, which is so important for areas like Alresford, where the main industry before fruit farming, it was gravel extraction. So it's really important to perhaps we should mention that. There's also again in Alresford, there's the Silver Jubilee, Queen Victoria's Silver Jubilee tree that was planted, and trees like that represent Queen Victoria's Silver Jubilee. It's so important, and trees like that. They may have a TPO on them, but they are the historical.
Is it on public land?
It is on public land.
But it hasn't.
All I'm saying is, Chairman, I think we should really emphasise the fact. Yes, I know. I'm just saying it should be important that things like that, Silver Jubilee, Gold Jubilees, for important things like the Queen Victoria, should be protected too. The other thing is, which is really interesting, is the creeks. If you go from Alresford Creek along to Wivenhoe, there is the footways, the overgrown. There's no maintenance and upkeep, and it says there protecting estuaries and walkways and places like that. But Essex County Council are the people responsible to protect our creeks and walkways. So in one hand they're saying protect them, and then in another department down the corridor of probably Essex County Council says, oh no, we're not going to do any more on that. So there should be consistency there. And finally, Chairman, there's a lot of public walkways. I think I might have mentioned to Councillor Fairley some time ago about public walkways in our district, and there are some walkways, public rights of way, they're going to be closed by Essex County Council, which are used by people, but they're putting out their idea to close them. And there's some footways where places in Great Bromley where they're quite keen to close footways, where Essex County Council doesn't agree about closing footways. So there's no consistency there. And finally, Chairman, I do note in here that they talk about ancient lanes. Well, I would wish the council would be a bit more vigorous at protecting ancient lanes, because there was the only ancient lane in Alresford, Cockayne's Lane, where Chairman and Councillor Fairley is aware of, that we tried to stop development down there, and in time we had development built, and we have to protect the rural character of our ancient lanes, and we must emphasise that, because if we carry on building in areas and removing these ancient lanes, what's the point of having a policy of keeping the rural character of an ancient lane when we're getting rid of them and building them? Apart from that, Chairman, everything's all right.
You like the report?
Yeah.
I do applaud you, actually, Councillor Scott, on this, because it's local knowledge. And this is what we all know our own patches, and you obviously know yours very well. So these comments, I was just wondering, rather than, as you've just sort of, gone through them, would you be prepared to send an email, drop a line to Mr. Guyver, outlining the comments you've made, and with a little bit of substance underneath, so that he can then put this into the report that will go to Cabinet?
I do welcome that, Chairman, and I think we also have to bear in mind, I remember some time ago in Manningtree they were removing the curbstones, and everyone went berserk because of the listed area. In my part of the world, they removed a load of curbstones and replaced them with these awful gravel concrete stones, and all because they'd run out of them elsewhere in another part of the county. That's frankly unacceptable. Yeah. They're the kind of things we really have to come down hard on Essex County Council. You can't have one report saying we've got to protect these areas, these curbstones and signs, and another department goes, oh, don't worry about it, we get rid of it.
This is the whole point of this, and this is why we're just commenting and not actually approving it, because it's part of a bigger strategy, and the idea of that is to join everything up with no overreaching strategy to maintain and enhance our district. Now, as regards, just to come back to you, if I may, because I have beaten and won and kept many paths around our way open. A public footpath has tremendous law around it. They cannot close a public footpath without offering an alternative. And what you do is refuse the alternative and then demand that they show the need to close it. A lot of it is the convenience for certain landowners, or because of somebody think there was one in particular around the backwaters, around Kirby-le-Soken, where they turned around and they said, oh, well, it's, we can't maintain the sea walls. Well, when you walked around it, there was no increase in tide, none whatsoever. You could see it. It was down there. You could see the tide marks. And I actually had I can't remember who it was now, in fact, the senior, of the Environment Agency. Yeah, Charlie, what's his name? What was he just retired. Yeah. Anyway, he came before, and I said to him, "There's no need. Go and have a look," and kept it open. Another one they closed on us, and I forced that to be open, and that went through to judicial review. Had a public inquiry here. So never stand back. There's lots of law around it, and they cannot close it without offering an alternative.
Chairman, I will definitely send an email to the officers.
Thank you.
With my patch, obviously I don't know whether Councillor Wiggins will add comments to it. There may be other councillors from Clinton to Manchester might want to add.
Well, having said that, Mr. Guyver has already stated that we've got the first bite of the cherry here, and also it will be going out to all councillors after us. So we've got him first, and thank you for that. Councillor Chapman, did you wish to come back?
I'm sure everybody's going to be emailing you now with things that they want in their area, but I've just quickly flicked through, and the only building you've got of Brightlingsea is probably our newest designed museum. But we're one of the few places that happens to have 2 Grade 1 listed buildings, salt marshes and oyster beds. So we've got a huge history. So if it's okay with the chairman and yourself, I'm going to be emailing you also.
Yes. Trim. Oh, members, please. You're experienced members. You should know this. That you go around a footpath, if it's overgrown, you report it to county, and then you speak to your county, then go and speak to our engineering department, who have a ranger system which are there in place to do these small works. I have no problems whatsoever in the Frinton and Walton Town Council area that I am aware of. I'll say I'm aware of, because we use the rangers, and the rangers here in Tendring are considered best practice in the county. So you can do it. It's there in your own power. It doesn't need to go any further. Finally, speak to your county. Speak to your county councillor. That's enough. Right, enough of that. Any other comments that you'd like to go forward to Cabinet, please? And I've just been informed there will be an all-members briefing on these strategies and on the coming up in the not-too-distant future. Have you? Missed it. I was there. All right, sorry. Right, we've got egg on our faces. Right, move on. Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Mrs. Hastings. Councillor Hastings. There we are. It was, yes. I do remember it now. Yeah, I went to sleep during it. Any other comments to go forward? I have some here, but I'll just a few. There's 1 or 2 typos I picked up. But the other one is that I'm very annoyed about in our patch, actually, which I picked up on. We've got all these wonderful Martello towers in our area. I can't remember how many other. Those together with the stations. We're very well endowed in lots of places, Tendring. We underperform. And one of the things I've asked for, or would like to ask for, is the council ought to seize the opportunities to secure improvements and repairs to listed buildings through S106 agreements where they are affected by new developments. An example of this, which didn't happen, is the Martello Tower and the Taylor Wimpey development in Walton on the Naze. If you take that, if anyone knows, it's Mill Lane again, where we were discussing earlier. If you look down, there's a Martello Tower there, and they've allowed, I think, about a 20 or 30 degree arc so people can see it. And the rest of it is surrounded by buildings. Over 300 buildings have gone up round that tower, or close to that tower. Now, an S106 would have produced tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of pounds of money to help do it up. They are very expensive to do up, Martello Towers. I do know when I was chairman and I opened the one in Jaywick, Essex County Council did, I think they spent 1.2 million on it. And I also know about the one on West Beach, because I've seen the surveyor's report on it when we looked at it. And they'll never fall down because they're so thick, but inside, the best description I think I came up with is it's like opening a pork pie in your fridge after it'd been in there 5 weeks. So, no, I don't eat pork pies. But I think you've got the analogy. And the inside of these things are horrendous, especially if they've been sealed, because the water hasn't come out. So it's done a lot. So they are expensive to repair. But I do believe there is the wherewithal to do, certainly, if any cosmetic repairs, some really serious repairs, so we can hand it on to the next generation.
The National Lottery Fund.
Yes.
Realise tendering exists.
Yeah.
At last, yeah.
You know, because we, as we reported, you know, we've been lacking in funds from them. They know it.
Yeah.
And I think they're embarrassed with it, so we
Yeah.
need to get all this.
I agree. The same with, what is it? What's the other one? The Cultural Fund. Arts England, or whatever it's called. Arts Council. Yeah. The other...
As far as the stations are concerned, you've got Frinton Station, which is look good, done up. Also, the Dover Court one. It's an enhancement to what you're doing.
No, I agree.
The Dover Court one is
It's a lovely place, I agree, yeah. I've actually, a few years back, I took the chief executive to the top of the Milton Road car park and I said, look, if we tidy all that up, you've got a wonderful vista. And eventually, actually, they've cottoned on. It's going...
You see it on the shelf?
Yeah, I know, yeah. Anyway, the other one I did mention up, but that you may well be aware of, is the Victorian County history regarding your comments, Councillor Scott. Those of you who may not be aware of it, when I first became a councillor here in 1999, I was shoved on a museum's sub-working party committee, something or other anyway. Very interesting it was. That's where I discovered Victorian County history. What it was, in 1899, a group of concerned subjects decided that we better record our history. And so what they did in every county in England, I don't know whether, probably Wales, I'm not sure about Scotland and Ireland, they set up an organisation, hence the fact it's Victorian, because Queen Victoria was still on the throne and became the patron. And what they do is they go round the whole county like the Forth Bridge. And they've just finished Tendring and Colchester. I think they're moving now and down onto the Dengie. And they've been on us for about 10 years, 11 years. And then by the time they get back round here, it'll probably be about 2060, 2070. There'll be another 50 years of history or partial history for them to record and put down. So if anyone... So they're a wonderful organisation. They're absolutely...
Are you referring to the Victorian Society?
No, I'm not. I'm referring to the Victorian County history.
I think the Victorian Society is a national...
That's national. This isn't national. This is county.
They have a lot of clout, the Victorian
Yeah,
Society.
yeah.
If they feel there's iconic buildings anywhere in our district which could be not being getting funding or not being preserved, the Victorian Society will push the funding.
Yes, we know, we do know. But I know about it because they did a very good report for Frinton some years back. No, this is Victoria County history, referring to what you were referring to earlier about your creeks, inlets, about Roman bricks being used 5 centuries later to build a 9th century church, all right, the 10th century church, because the Romans did leave us in 460 and arrived here in 55 BC. So there is, we've got all this now. So these comments, is everyone, any other comments anyone would like to pass to the Cabinet? No? Right, thank you. Well, if that's the case, I'll move on to the next item. Thank you very much. Okay, you happy with that? Yeah, lovely, thank you. Yeah, do. Yes, please, yeah. Gary gave it to me. So. Right, you'll be pleased to hear, Draft Heritage. We're on to the final item this evening, item 10. Pages 431, to provide members an overview of the Livewell Development Accreditation Scheme, to seek endorsement of the scheme and to outline the next steps for promotion of the scheme. Mr Marshall, would you care to comment? Evening.
Livewell developed a presentation scheme part of the Accreditation scheme, and it's controlled by Essex County Council, which means trouble. This is a voluntary scheme, so developers do not have to take part.
indeed, Mr. Marshall. Mr. Gardner.
Thank you, Chairman. Okay, so the design, layout, quality of new housing development can have a significant bearing on health and well-being of its residents, and promoting healthier lifestyles and well-being is one of the Council's corporate priorities, and the planning policies in our new local plan already promote measures aimed at improving the health and well-being of residents. And they also require, and this is in policy, that the health impacts of residential developments are assessed for schemes of 50 or more houses through a health impact assessment, and that's consistent with NHS and Essex County Council policy when we're looking at larger residential developments. So these principles also form an important part of the Essex Design Guide for residential and mixed-use areas, which is a long-standing Bible of how you go about designing and laying out residential schemes in Essex, and tendering, of course. Now, this Livewell Accreditation scheme has been set up by Essex authorities working together in partnership with health practitioners, the County Council's public health team and other relevant stakeholders, and that is to complement these policies and to encourage and incentivise developers in the early stages of the planning process to incorporate measures aimed at promoting health and well-being. As Mr Marshall rightly says, it's a voluntary scheme through which developers can seek assessment and formal recognition of the quality of the developments, and the scheme can culminate in the award of bronze, silver or gold rating for the development in question. Mr Marshall made the point about who wants a bronze. No doubt we'll come on to that. Developments are assessed against a series of criteria to determine how well they embed health design principles into their schemes as they emerge. And the criteria within the document you've got there, which starts on page 437, include the design of homes and spaces, so that includes the quality, functionality of the open spaces, the mix of housing, standards of accessibility for housing of people of all ages and abilities. 2, active environment and connectivity, and that includes incorporating safe walking and cycling routes, cycle storage, public transport, appropriate traffic calming, and good surveillance. These are just a few of the examples. 3, environmental sustainability, so things like charging points for electric vehicles, air quality measures, good ventilation, energy efficiency, and water conservation measures. 4, supporting communities, so that includes things like the provision of community and healthcare facilities where appropriate, community involvement and information packs for new residents. So we already have information packs for residents for transport, public transport, but I think this is looking to widen it out even further. Access to healthy food environments, so things like space for allotments, vegetable patches, avoiding locations near takeaways, and this issue about concentrations of takeaways, and supporting healthy food choices, and improving access to education, skills and employment, so including things like access to employment opportunities by walking, cycling and public transport, provision of local facilities, on-site training and apprenticeships for construction workers. And actually we already have a scheme where we actually require developers to submit details of how they would appoint their contractors locally and train contractors locally as well. So we already do some of these things. Now, the Livewell Development Accreditation Guidance, you've got there from page 437 in your agenda. And there's also a charter that developers and the council can enter into, and developers can express their commitment to the principles within this guidance. If I can take you to the recommendation on page 431 of your agenda, we're looking for the committee to note the report, the contents of this report, and the Livewell Development Accreditation Scheme, and to endorse the promotion of this scheme in our district. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Guyver. Councillor Allen.
All looks good and sounds nice, and the restriction on 50 houses, though, or more, I mean, these are going to cost a lot more money. I can't see why they, if the developer's prepared to pay this to get it done, why can't it be less than 50? Because you're talking about these, say, the NHS and all this. You've got to talk about clusters again of big housing developments like that. Whereas I would have thought places like this would suit smaller ones. And so, is there any reason why the 50? And it's not. I'm not talking about just because they're expensive and they don't think the developers will do them. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, happy to respond. I mean, there's no restriction. Schemes of less than 50 can enter into this accreditation scheme, but at the moment the policies require that for schemes of 50 or more, there's a requirement to do a health impact assessment. All of this is over and above a health impact assessment, and this can apply to schemes of 50 or below 50, so it can apply to all scales of development. Oh, okay. Thank you. Mrs. Bicknell has kindly pointed out on page 456 of your agenda, there's actually a system for smaller schemes where categories 1, 2 and 3 of the various categories are specifically applicable to those smaller schemes. So it's a lighter touch, if you like, assessment, but it does apply to smaller developments as well as the larger ones.
The advantage of this to a developer, because normally they're money grabbers and they just the cheapest house sell it for the most they can get. Why would they want to do this? Is it because you would look favourably on a planning permission if they're going to go for this accreditation? And how do you guarantee it's like that when the job's finished?
Okay, no, that's a very good point. I mean, what this is encouraged at the pre-application stage, because there is a requirement for us to assess the health implications of these developments, and by doing a lot of this work at the pre-application stage, they can demonstrate to the council that they've done as much as they can to make sure this is a good quality development that ticks all of the boxes. But over and above that, if you've got an accredited scheme, that ain't half good for your reputation as a developer, and in terms of your reputation not only to councils but your reputation to the purchasers of properties in the future as well. So there's two aspects to it. One, yes, it can help them to improve the scheme in the run-up to an application, to give it a smoother path, and two, it's a badge of quality that they can boast about their product.
Well, certainly, Councillor Chapman.
Sorry, I'm going to have to give my apologies. I've got to give a report at another meeting at 9 o'clock.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And it is on the 12th of December. And may I be the wish to... Well, I'll see you before that, because our next meeting will be probably be in the spring. Councillor Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. I think the charter is quite important, and I think it will encourage developers to have that in their marketing literature when they're selling their properties, like Vaughan and Blythe, Rose, Haley Wimpey. So if they've got that in, there's a lot of people out there who like to buy houses with solar panels already there and everything else. I know the 5 properties in my ward where they've got solar panels on the roof and charging points and everything else, they've gone instantly, they've sold instantly, and I suspect they probably might have had that and they're ready. But in terms of, on page 450, it says environmental sustainability. Well, it coincides with the climate change committee that I also sit on, and I think Councillor Allen and others sit on. And if developers start doing things like this. It ticks our boxes as well in terms of the Climate Change Committee. Oh, sorry, your Vice Chair also sits on the Climate Change Committee. And I think it's important that we should... Well, where Councillor Stock, the leader of the council, has established one, and Councillor Alan Coley is the excellent chairman of that committee. All I'm saying is, with this, coincide with the Climate Change Committee, we can work together on this.
Yep, excellent. Any other comments? Make, and I'm going to pick, and I hope Councillor Allen will follow me on this because he was the one that first told me about it, which is the considerate contractor scheme. Yeah, which I've looked into, and having been subject to and a victim of a lot of development immediately around my house over the last 3.5 years, that we have to come in with some much stronger policies as regards how contractors act, behave, because they have certainly detracted 20 to 25% of our health and well-being in our house. We have not been able to enjoy it as we should be allowed to enjoy it because of the noise. Even when you ask them something simple like don't use power tools before 9 o'clock in the morning, they choose to ignore that. Swearing, radios on. Everyone knows me, I can hold my own corner and do so. Parking everywhere. And I always remember many years ago, again, Councillor Allen, when we were in Town Council in the 90s, mentioning the fact that you weren't allowed off a site in London unless you cleaned your wheels. And we all laughed at it. Now it's standard practice. So I think the considerate contractor scheme and other informative, for instance, was one our local residents association came up with, which we're slowly getting to grips with in the district, which was agreed, and it's taken us 4 years to get this simple little thing in about, on completion of the development, all roads, footpaths, cycleways, covers, gratings, fences, barriers, etc., 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 and in the area covered, any neighbouring areas affected by must be left in a functional, repaired and in renovated state to the standard accepted by the appropriate statutory authority. In other words, leave the public realm better than found. Yeah. It's informative. We cannot make it statutory, but it should be on the bottom of all our planning conditions, and it isn't. It's only if... I know, it was agreed. I'm not joking. We've been working on this... because we learnt this lesson when Persimmons were building in Frinton. And the then chairman of the FRA and I worked very closely on it and went up there. And in the end, we made them put on false chimney pots. We made them do up the road. Yeah. But I mean, these are the things that makes life worth living. We would, to use another analogy that we used in the town council, we wouldn't grant permission for a concrete crushing machine in a residential area. And what's a building site? We don't know if you grant a permission for that, how long that business is going to last. And when you've got to considering the 200, 550, 200, now up to, was it 900 houses or something? You're talking decades on 900 houses being built at the rate they're building nowadays. So I really do think we need to firm up on this and get as much as we can. And anyone else like to comment on that?
We need to do it
Yeah.
so completely demolish the pavements and
Yeah. Councillor Allen? No?
No, it just...
In other words, I think I'll ask for a proposer and a seconder in a moment. Did you want to come back on anything? No. Yeah, fine. Thank you very much. But I do think we ought to therefore consider for something, if we can fit it in the timetables, which are obviously our officers will come back to, on anything else, which are, let's be fair, we aren't imposing this, we're asking the contractors to do this. So they are voluntary schemes. But with all the development that is going on, and it is a nightmare when you live next door to them, it really is. No, bylaws, you need to go to the Secretary of State. That'll take about 10 years, by which time they'll either gone bankrupt or built it all. Yeah.
The intention is that we'd make them aware of it at the pre-application stage, whereas at the moment, because it's not been because it's not been endorsed as yet, we haven't been doing that to date. But if it's endorsed today, we will. Yeah.
And then it goes on to where?
We use it. We start using it and promoting it when we have pre-application discussions with developer. It supports policies that are already in the plan, and as a council, we start using it.
So once the councillors on here vote for this Livewell stuff, then it will go to the point. So when applicants come in with their pre-apps, then from that point onwards, we're shown this document.
Absolutely.
And,
Yep.
I mean, we don't force the document on them, do we? We just say, by the way, we'd like you to look at this document, and we encourage you to.
Yeah. It's a separate thing, it's a separate scheme. But I think what I deliberately brought it into this, to make those who aren't aware of it, and B, it's something we can ask this committee to look at in the not too distant at our next meeting.
I welcome that, but I was also meant to.
Yes, we do still impose conditions on developers to submit a construction method statement, which sets out details of wheel washing facilities, the routes that they're going to bring articulated lorries in, that kind of thing. And that has to be approved prior to the commencement of a development. But I think what Councillor Turner is more referring to is the day-to-day work of the contractors and working in a considerate manner. On a day-to-day basis, keeping the noise down where they can, just being generally considerate of the neighbours around them. Whereas the construction management thing that we impose is very much an operational thing about where lorries come in, what times they can work. This is more of a sort of, on a day-to-day basis, developers behaving in an appropriate manner.
Haven't seen it in any conditions I've read. It may be on large sites, but I certainly haven't. And I do know that Councillor Bray was very insistent, especially over the hot summer, on the dust issues. Those are individual policy building conditions played on. This is an overall scheme, much like similar. Most of the stuff in here, by the way, could be put under building regs and design. But the point about it is bringing it back together as one, and it's about making our district better. I mean, one of the houses just up the road from me, somebody must have spent $500,000 or more on it doing it up, and it was absolutely fabulous. You never heard a word. One of the local builders was involved. I remember they put tarpaulins on the road when they had, they had a lot of landscaping done, so there was a lot of earth moving coming in, and it was absolutely superb. You wouldn't have known the development was there except as you passed it, and the vans, that was it. And that's how it should be. Anyway, enough of that. You've proposed it. A second, thank you very much. Councillor Newton, all those in favour, please show. Thank you, unanimous again. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all. I'm going to cancel the meeting which is scheduled in here for the 11th of December for various reasons. One of them is that obviously on the 12th something's going to happen. And the other thing is the officers are up to their necks in work at the moment, plus the fact they've got to be ready and prepare all this for the next part of the examination starting on the 14th of January. And I think our next meeting will probably be round about late winter, early spring, when I have time to bring back another 500-page agenda for us to peruse. And may I thank you all very much. Be the first to wish you happy Christmas. And I'd like to thank particularly Mr. Guyver for his superb import once more. And thank you, and thanks once again. Safe journey home.
Excellent.